My name is Mazibuko Jaha. I'm from the Eastern Cape of South Africa. I'm not a lawyer at all. But that's fine. Let's see how it goes. Let's do this. Just take a minute, answer one question for me. What is political economy? Please share with the person next to you, one or two people next to you, what your idea is. Let's share. How is it going? What's our sense of it? What questions have arisen that are not asked there? What answers have people come up with? What other dimensions?
So we had various definitions of political economy from the more very textbook sets of theories and models and systems that that you use to understand dynamics in politics, to another definition of like political economy, more describing a measurement of powerful resources, or the measurement and or distribution of resources, and that led to a discussion of natural law versus or natural law kind of
versus like political constructs that are driven by economic interests, or it's all about resources, control, power, and then manipulation of natural law, maybe manipulation of rights, and then the idea of this kind of colonial structure where you always have this politically and economically weak majority versus some kind of favored minority that's like politically and economically powerful.
Well, I mean, we spoke about sort of this very complex interconnectedness of the political, social, and economic systems, structures, institutions, and how they perpetuate inequality, or how they bolster each other, legitimize each other, based on also cultural and other kinds of power, which I think we have to look at as well. You can't just, nothing can be taken for granted.
Okay. Can I reinterpret you?
Please.
Law can't be neutral. Huh? Is that a fair reinterpretation?
Yeah, I think that's obvious, isn't it?
Okay.
I'm not a lawyer, so I mean, I would think that that's pretty obvious.
Okay, that's fine. Any other person willing to share? That group I didn't disturb them, but I was listening carefully. Yeah, the two of you. I was listening, and there were some interesting thrusts emerging.
Well, we kind of discussed the fact that we feel like maybe the system that there's a system of white supremacy, a system of patriarchy that kind of shapes the law, and it ends up being this, not cyclical, but like almost like the snake eating its tail, because if in our original document there's a clear hierarchy, there's a clear kind of caste system, then any law that results from that would inherently be flawed, will inherently leave people out, and will make it so that people aren't, like, I guess, protected or covered by its like what the law is supposed to do. So we're just looking at it like this: the system in this country is shaped by those forces, and all the laws that result from them are like have those like inherently in there. So and that's what we're teasing out.
So I'm not familiar with the concept of political economy, so I kind of made up my own definition. In my mind, it fundamentally starts with a recognition of the fact that the economy is not some ex nihilo existing entity. It's something that's the product of political constructs in which we all engage. And in my view, the role of the law in that construct is the mechanism by which it is continually upheld in such a way that it becomes acceptable.
I think when you were talking before, I don't know if any of you have read it, but I was thinking about Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and and the way the government forces, military forces are used to protect certain, corporate and financial interests, while exploitive, interests that, those are
something that Kate and I talked about. We were talking about being involved in the law, like trying to be a lawyer, particularly in direct services, and trying to meet with people and talk about the fundamental flaws of the situation that they're in. Like, it's not only unfair that someone is arrested, but the fact that they are targeted and the fact that they become part of the system at all is not right. Beyond the small other injustices of the system, just the fact that they're introduced to it all is wrong, and because of like deeper structural problems. And it's hard to try to do any kind of small advocacy within that because it's so like wrong from the get-go.
So then you're talking about then things about that have to focus on change on a wider scale, not just on an individualized basis. As important as individual cases of struggles are.
We were also
Because the problem is system-wide. Sorry.
we were also talking a bit about how political economy can be a framework for analyzing social situations where you recognize that access to various political resources like law enforcement protection and physical resources like housing and education are a form of currency or of social capital.
The 1913 Land Act in South Africa made it legal that 87% of the land was owned by a minority. It was not just because people had prejudices. A political institution came into being to ensure that law was in place. But there were very clear economic interests that were being served by that. And it became law. Of course, we'll still come to another discussion later on about both sides of the equation. How law plays a role. I think that's what you are saying. To then facilitate the combination of political and economic interests. Rather, the combination of political institutions and economic interests. Now, the other side that a conference such as this would come from is how law then can be used to challenge a given system or structure of established political institutions that serve particular economic interests. Okay. Anyone wants to go home yet? Or go to another workshop? Are we together? Are we building it together? Huh? Okay. My brother, you have a hand.
I was gonna I can hear like the last part of the question.
Oh, I've forgotten it myself too. Man, we'll get. The workshop is repetitive, so if you missed it now, it will come back. Okay.
I think you just mentioned the idea that the law can be both a mechanism for upholding these distributions of social power, and then there's another side where the law can be used a different way.
Yeah.
I just wanted to bring up a point that somebody brought up in the corner over there, which is that law is inherently non-neutral. It has to be doing one or the other.
Yeah.
And I think that's obvious to a lot of people in this room, but I think it's something that's non-obvious to the vast majority of practicing lawyers in this country, who assume that not only their role in the world, but also their profession in the world is completely neutral. And I think political economy is a way of dispelling that mythology.
So I was an organizer in a space outside Cape Town. We had a radical union, a small union, but quite farm workers union. It had some of its workers arrested because they had basically forcibly occupied the offices of the employer. We couldn't find a single progressive advocate. In South Africa, there are attorneys and then solicitors. Am I right? That's the distinction, eh? Lawyer, advocate?
Attorney advocate.
Yeah, attorney advocate. How do you, in the US it's not the same.
Just a lawyer.
Okay, but anyway. We're to find an advocate. Oh, barrister, that's the word I was looking for, barrister. So when you find a barrister, the only one who could find said to these guys, just admit that you are wrong. And then this admission of guilt will remove this completely. Of course, there's a wider debate about attorney-client relationship there, but from a political economic perspective, what that would have done is basically to set the nature of the relations between that fighting union and the employers in ways that perpetuate what the workers were fighting. So there's a very long extension, at every step of this value chain. How you, it was that advocate was informed basically by the fact that they shouldn't have occupied the office. That's a particular set of values, of principles, of notions of how to conduct oneself in the given political economic situation. I'm bringing that as a practical example if you don't start your analysis of the problem you're facing as a lawyer from a particular standpoint, in particular in this case, political economy. It's not practical enough yet to get them. Okay, any other contribution? Any questions that came up in the discussion? Any disagreements with any point that has been made? Helpful? Useless? People are confused. People want me to speak. I'm not going to speak. You're going to speak. So if we want to discuss it further, we can. But I think we've covered it in our discussion. If you want to put it in terms of a diagram, there it is. In the world, it's not just about the economy, the world of work. But you can think about a similar set of relations when it comes to other categories that define the rest of society. So basically, political economy is an approach that throughout seeks to say what are the connections between politics and economics. And at the heart of politics, as we know, is power, isn't it? I'm taking shortcuts for now. It will still build up as a story, but I'm very keen to have you guys being the main narrators of the story, not me. Okay, let's leave that. But now there are different traditions to political economy. Here, this comes from the school of Adam Smith and Ricardo. Having just qualified that a bit. Now, in the tradition established by Adam Smith and Ricardo of political economy, basically uses a range of concepts. How it understands the economy, how it emphasizes the role of the market in facilitating exchange, the individual being this person with these attributes, the efficient individual, the efficient firm, who's always looking to maximize their value and benefit from whatever they do, to the point of also securing profits and so on. That's that school of thought. The consumer must be sovereign, and in that basis, then the market will function efficiently to the point where there's harmony and consensus, and the market will always correct if there's no equilibrium. So that's that school of thought, and therefore the state must not really play a big role here. It must just enable people to be these efficient individuals. So that's a particular school of political economy, why it sets up the relationship between political institutions and economic institutions. So when you hear the phrase political economy, do not assume that it necessarily means a progressive or a left take on things. There is a very well established political economy tradition. The most famous people would be Ricardo and Adam Smith, going back to the tradition of British political economy. Are we together? Okay. Now, then, in the 19th century, there emerges this school of thought then that uses, by the way, this foundation to then critique this very foundation. And then, in using it, basically, it looks then at the nature, form of the labor process. How is this individual who's so efficient actually producing this profit? How is that process? How's that process of producing profit, and how is that profit controlled and distributed? By starting with that question, then actually they conclude that that kind of society, that is a society that's based on different social classes existing. One class of those who own, another class of those who work. Therefore, what you're talking about in the earlier slide are social relations of production. they call it in this instance class relations. I've mentioned profit, I've mentioned capital accumulation, but then they are saying, given the inequity in this system, it's obvious that there will be antagonisms, there will be conflict. And it's not a mistake that from time to time you'll have the economy going up and down, that you'll actually have disequilibrium. It's the nature of the system. That's the one conclusion they wrote. They conclude. They reach. The one conclusion they reach. But then the major point they make is that the state is not a neutral player in this set of relations, in this set of processes and institutions. The state has a particular role to play to facilitate the achievement and realization of particular class interests. That's a summary of very many long controversial debates between the two schools, but within the two schools. Then there have been other developments in this century, institutional economics coming with their own take and so on. But this is, if in terms of the historical evolution of the concept of political economy, these are the two foundational schools. Any questions so far? Okay, I'm going back to you then. Let's take globalization. I won't even spend time on that, as to what globalization is, what triggers it, and so on. But we know all of these things. Globalization of finance, trade, culture, similar concerns around the environment, around human rights. But what is actually happening? That's another component of a political economy approach to analyzing situations. It's a crucial question. How do you understand the processes that shape a particular situation you're looking at? Nothing is given. It's not given that McDonald's will be everywhere in the world. Why has it happened? Are we together? I'm not sure how to read your faces. Okay. And in the process of what is happening and why it is happening and how it is happening, if you're, for example, to take up a case on trade-related intellectual property rights, what does that mean for the location of these drug companies in terms of where they produce from, where they get their raw materials, the location of their markets? South Africa constitutes only 1% of the global drug market. When I say drug, I mean pharmaceuticals. And yet, for a long while, pharmaceutical companies were making 5% of their profits from South Africa. So, as a lawyer, what does that mean for how you approach a case on trade-related intellectual property rights if we are to challenge the implication of patent law in ways that affect access to drugs?
But then you look at the social costs, the externalities, all the other costs that are being absorbed by other people, and is it efficient? It's efficient for them, it's profitable for them, but is it efficient for us? Is it efficient for community, for society? You can say the same with the energy industry and the extractive industries that are subsidized through oil and gas exploration, fracking. It's efficient for the oil and gas companies making a lot of money, and they're using their wealth to create regulations that allows them to exploit the resources, often at our costs, and then we're buying it at a falsely low price without thinking about all these other costs that we're bearing, whether health costs, climate change, etc.
There was the one famous moment was the community reinvestment legislation here in the US, which was quite interesting because it was exactly about that.
What legislation?
Community reinvestment legislation.
CRA?
Yeah. Was it late 80s or early 90s?
The Community Reinvestment Act?
Yeah. Basically asking those questions. Why should a branch of a bank move from a particular zone? What economic efficiencies are achieved? For who? From which perspective? That's exactly the question, the distributional effects of the decision to move that branch of the bank or or not just the branch, but even bigger questions about who they give loans to and where. The mandate of the state to realize its socio-economic goals in terms of the constitution. So if you take a decision to privatize the provision of housing, can you, Kate, argue as a lawyer that that will affect the capacity of the state to meet its constitutional mandate? That's a long stretch, but that's the kind of challenge radical lawyers will have to think through. But you can ask another set of questions with regards to that, expand this second question in various ways. What rights, what interests will be affected? And what can be done about them? So from the perspective of South Africa, normally the resort by us progressive organizers and by radical lawyers is to say, if this decision is taken in ways that benefit those with economic interests, then what we're going to do is to claim and invoke the constitution of the country. So normally we would take it back to the constitutional terrain, which is fairly progressive in terms of granting socio-economic rights. But that does not apply everywhere. I do not know what the context is in the US. I think it would be interesting to hear views on how then you would answer that question. How do you advance rights? What is to be done to advance rights, having done this analysis?
One of the biggest problems in the US is that there's a long-standing and increasingly powerful interpretation of our Constitution that is fundamentally libertarian. And I mean that in the sense that it's only concerned with the power exercised by the state and no other accumulations of social power are considered. So the mobility of capital will not be taken into consideration. And so that begs the question, in the United States, is it effective to appeal to the Constitution, given that long-standing interpretation, in order to resolve these other privatized accumulations of capital and wealth that are shifting?
So then that's a fundamental question, because it goes beyond the narrow terrain of black and white law. Black and white letter law, as you guys say it.
But I don't
So let me just conclude. So for me, this is a crucial question about the social forces who must fight it out, because ultimately you're taking it to that terrain. That ultimately, if the legal system plays this role in terms of the ideological makeup of this country, then what we do in South Africa, actually clearly is not applicable in many instances where you want to advance rights. Then there's a crucial question. Law can go only this far in that instance. What then needs to be done to solve it in social and political terms? Social and political forces, which then is not necessarily the terrain of lawyers. But as lawyers, you need to think about that. That's how the other workshop is debating.
I think as rebellious and radical lawyers, we have to continue to advocate for what we feel is the correct and appropriate interpretation of the Constitution as a breathing, evolving document. Second, if we can't make progress on that front, then we've got legislative and other disruptive and rebellious, more contentious actions that I think we might partake in outside of our legal capacity, but as activists and as citizens.
In many cases, a white lawyer such as Kate would be challenged in South Africa when she represents a client that, no, you're a white lawyer, you don't understand what is happening here. This is a cultural issue. That's what people would say. And yet, if you had to apply the political economy lens even into that cultural issue, there'll be questions of power. There'll be questions of who benefits. There'll be questions of who loses. It can be overly economically deterministic in a way that excludes other explanations of life. That's why I put that last bullet there. Explanations of life, explanations of cities, of societies.
And I think one sticky one is how people apply kind of moral explanations to these things. So the speaker that we just listened to talked about how people sometimes use religion to organize how they see things, and that can be hard when people say, oh, you're in that position because you're destined to be, because you are the chosen, you are just any kind of different kind of moral or religious explanation
other use of religion famously was in preventing women to have the right to terminate pregnancies. There it would be difficult to apply a political economy lens. One can try, but religion would be a very useful thing to think about. What's the relationship between religion and law? How do you address that? If we're in a Muslim country, I guess that kind of explanation would be quite critical, and in so many cases. The position of women, and I'm sure the feudal elite in some of the Muslim countries, and how they've used religion to occupy positions where they benefit and so on. I like that example. Are there other categories? We've mentioned culture, we've mentioned religion. I guess in the days of slavery, it was, there needed not to be any logical explanation as to why it must be white people who benefit in particular ways. So race being one. Of course, race would be related to history, to political economy. Michelle?
Well, even more than that would be science.
Uh-huh.
If there were a lot of scientific explanations for why, more than just a moral or religious background, but why white people were fundamentally and naturally superior, and why that was seen in genetics, and unfortunately that tradition continues today in a lot of our genetic medicine and research.
The key thing to take out from the political economy tool is critical consciousness. It's the ability to develop critical consciousness, the ability to develop critical tools of analysis, not to take things as givens. That's the main thing I would like you to pull out from the discussion up to now. Okay. When it comes to race, I just remembered, Kate, I don't know if you know this, but in South African law, there's a concept, I guess it's universal, when a court takes judicial notice of the fact that when traffic lights turn green, it means you must walk, and if they turn red, it means you must stop. That doesn't have to be proved by anyone. There's no need to lead evidence. So a judge in 1986 took judicial notice of the fact that black men step for no other reason other than the desire to. So black men step for no other reason other than the desire to. But anyway, now the interesting thing there is the construction of, because that then became established law until it was struck down later on. But it's a very perverse use of law to perpetuate race, and anyway, it's a small case of crime, but actually you can apply it across many other categories of how things were decided and how law played a role.
So I come from a background that's Palestinian and doing Palestine organizing, and have lived there, and have the opportunity to go to South Africa as well and meet with folks on the ground, including my people,
Lucky you.
and others. And part of, and I was younger then, that trip was really transformative in terms of understanding political economy for me. Maybe I didn't have the language at the time, but often, I think figure out ways to build solidarity through intersections of how our struggles are connected is really critical towards any
Yeah.
social reformation,
Oh, yeah.
any form of liberation. And the ANC in South Africa, actually, in the case of Palestine, was the way in which folks in the U.S., actually, especially Black folks, Black American folks, became committed to Palestine was thanks to the anti-apartheid struggle that said, if you stand with us, you also have to stand with Palestine. Folks who initially celebrated the creation of Israel, for example. So there's a history of that in South Africa.
Before you proceed, there's a very fundamental point which I think is the second thing for us to pull out from this workshop. How are social, political, and economic phenomena interrelated? And how
This dream that South Africa, the people managed to defeat apartheid without massive, there was bloodshed, plenty of bloodshed, but without what could erupt into massive civil war. And then, of course, which many people have talked about, written about, the persistence of economic apartheid on the ground despite the end of the apartheid regime. And in Palestine, it's
South Africa has, at least last year, 2013, according to police reports, 11,000 protests. On average, 1,000 people took place per protest, which comes to 11 million people. So there are these explosions everywhere, almost every day. That's one form of resistance. But the other form of resistance is in the cover of the conference. Cultural ways. If you look at those three kids, three young people, I can't find my cover now, but you find all sorts of expressions which are counterculture in a big way. And what is interesting is how the political elite in the state, which was in the liberation movement, doesn't understand this counterculture and seeks actually to impose forms of social control. Yeah. That's a very short answer. You can go into a long discussion, but Kate, that's my sense. I do not know what your sense is. Feel free. You are in the heat of it with your lawyer and Seri. What forms of resistance are you actually coming across in your legal work? Occupations of buildings. That's a big one. Occupation of land around rural questions. Whether it's envisioning women having land in their own name and right. I'm part of a movement that works on that. Or there are other initiatives around the solidarity economy, for example, but those are still very small and not yet present in any significant way. There was once that famous case of the Anti-Privatization Forum and the Soweto Electricity Crisis Committee reconnecting people. And when they were reconnecting people's electricity, which had been cut off, they were saying electricity is a promised free right. And we are now doing it from below, connecting in terms of what the Constitution had promised. So you've got elements of that, but by and large the form is resistance rather than envisioning a future. I think we're still several steps behind with regards to envisioning a future, Kate. And then?
I mean, if you look at the Constitution, laws, policies, social grants, we have quite a big welfare system actually in South Africa. And so, it's actually quite difficult to, because of all of this stuff, to resist when things are going badly, because it's a sense that actually everything's there. I mean, we have participation. If you talk about community participation, that's built into every law and policy you can imagine. So in theory, it's all there and it's great, but it's not being implemented properly. And I think people still they still have a sense that the ANC that's the case, and it's just this issue is really implementation and things people not understanding really what they need, and so working within that. And I think that's why for people going to court is a very taking a legal route and going to court is very enticing in some ways, because it's almost using the system. It's not like people have decided the system is broken. It's like the system is being perverted, or people just don't really understand what needs to happen. And so when you go there, when you use that, it's like saying, look, here we are, you guys seem to have forgotten about us, you don't seem to be wanting to listen to us, this is a good platform where we can actually see you and meet you and tell you, but it doesn't mean that we are going to, vote you out or,
This is the heart
have
of
a coup.
this is the heart of the problem. And yes, we know the Constitution. We know actually there are very many good laws, and the fight actually has been about implement it, get it right.
And all the service protests, the service delivery protests now are starting to become violent. So they've always been around. I think it's the new Constitution project is this compromise between having these. I clerked on the Constitutional Court for Albie Sachs, who wrote the new Constitution, and then for Edwin Cameron, who's this big. Hi, Kate. I remember
So
seeing
then
her years
people
ago,
have
but
not. I think
it's
this reality of these laws and the Constitution and this legal framework and so on disables envisioning something beyond. Yeah.
But I think the laws are really aspirational. I think there are amazing people on the ground trying to implement it, and it's just the problem with having a new democracy. If you talk to like the Chief Justice of the courts, if you talk to high government level or people there, I think the question is like, is the country buckling under the just incompetence of middle managers? It's not that people don't care from the top or the bottom.
It's that challenge, but what she was also pointing to, which is very important, is then the impact of neoliberalism, which is against the thrust of the constitution. Again, political economy comes in here. How did that happen? How did it happen that you've got, in this instance, a law, rather a set of laws in the constitution that actually was not just serving a narrow set of interests. It's a very rare moment in history, I guess. Also, when the revolution took place here in the 1770s, law was cast in a different way at that beginning moment. Now, it takes us then to this next set of slides. We've covered the first bullet, really, particularly the point you were making about the role that law plays to ensure that political institutions serve particular economic interests. This is a question in the pack, the sub-bullet. The question you have to think through all the time. What systems of inequality that are underlying the legal and political and economic institutions that drive the experience of your evicted clients, of your clients who cannot get immigration rights and so on. We'll cover that. Then, what I'm doing here is then to begin to disrupt. What is the role of law in challenging given systems and structures? What is the role of law, given that law can only go so far in relation to the power, mobilization, and fights of social forces? What limits are there to the use of law, given this political economy understanding? I'd like us to go back to some group discussion on these last two questions. Well, or three. Are they clear? Okay. You set yourselves however you want. I'm not going to say 1, 2, 3, 4 and divide people up. Let me just from what you're saying. But not a pushback, but for me, I'm always skeptical about law. My wife is the lawyer. I'm not the lawyer. I'm the skeptic. But I had a fascinating discussion at a seminar here in New York, organized by the International Commission on Labor Rights, which is progressive lawyers working on labor. They are about to release a report on precarious labor, contract labor. This report, what they are doing is to take Article 17 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and say what it means is that contract labor violates the right to freedom of association and the right of workers to form unions to protect their interests. Now, that's a in my view, very creative and radical use of a universal legal instrument. I heard you guys talking about the UN. So it doesn't win that right. It doesn't reverse any law or any court decision, but it can change the discourse if social forces are organized. It can give confidence to social forces. So for me, that's it could be a very interesting relation between the use of the law, at least at the interpretative level, and then what social forces who have to fight it out can do with this very progressive use of the law. I'm taking your point a bit in a different direction, but I thought let me twist your pessimistic perspective to something a bit more optimistic. But I'm not saying that's the final word. But what I'm trying to do is actually, like society, the use of law for good is push and pull all the time.
The progressive activity at the city level across the country, Seattle passing the $15 minimum wage. There's this great momentum of progressive energy in cities across the country. And for those of you who aren't aware, there's this organization called ALICE, which is positioning itself to become kind of the repository for progressive model laws at the local level in response to ALEC. That's really putting out a lot of great information and resources for people who are working at the city and state level.
It's in Haiti, and the United Nations peacekeeping troops brought in cholera. They essentially dumped human waste into the largest river in Haiti, and through gross negligence. And now 8,500 people have died, and 700,000 people have gotten it, in a population of only 10 million. So the question is, here's the UN, how do we hold them accountable? For a corporation, it seems like that would be easier, but they've claimed immunity in various different ways, contractually as well as through a convention. And so this is the organization where their whole goal is to promote human rights, and yet they're controlled by countries, right? It's not a monolithic body, it's controlled by the United States government and other governments. So we have this contrast between potentially the most sympathetic body in the world that understands the right to access to justice, and they're not even giving us a forum at all. And so but yet is controlled by governments, and it falls into the heart of political law and political economy structures that is not wanting to accept any liability, because that means governments would be the ones that would be having to pay for this, so they're saying no. So we've had to use we worked on this case for 2 years before we even got into into a court, right? And so we finally are into a court, but before that and during that, sort of the mortar is what we talked about in our Baker conference earlier. Like, the mortar of all of this, besides the bricks, has been media work, a ton. Brian's been on every major news station in the world. A ton of media work, a ton of organizing work with cholera victims, which is very challenging, as you can imagine. It's also lobbying members of the UN. I mean, it's everybody. It's creative. It's at high levels. It's at low levels. It's at all levels, and that's what we think. That kind of pressure is the only thing that will win the case, and that the legal piece of it
The
is
law has
super
been used to
important,
tighten up any opportunities, but now it has to be the social forces that fight it out.
The UN, like you said, isn't a monolith and doesn't function in a vacuum. It's part of a system, a
Yeah.
structure of, not just the not-for-profit industry, but also that itself is also neoliberal in the way that it is distributed. I mean, the Palestinian economy is entirely that, and same with Haiti. And oftentimes that actively works to subvert social movement for radical change. And that's exactly the case post-Oslo. And I think that has also been the same role within Haiti as well. And so when we were discussing, and that's not just the UN, that goes across the board, we were discussing the distinction between, like, the law as a means and tool for survival, right? And rights-based approaches versus liberation, and how rights-based can be a tool, for people's material reality. Regardless of what we say in this room, if you have to wake up each day to survive, that does matter. And so that is really critical. But we should still think of it not as the end goal, but the end goal to be that dream that we're talking about of liberation, envisioning that new
Because rights can be used in very problematic ways. Okay. I'm happy. Anyone who's not unhappy? Who's not happy?
I
You must be the happiest chap around.
I had a question about political economy as a general concept. You mentioned earlier that it encompasses both neoliberal capitalism and Marxism, and that they're each a lens through which we can view reality. And so my question coming from that is, how useful is political economy as a tool for social justice movements, given that it is inherently indeterminate? It seems like political economy is more about descriptive truth as opposed to prescriptive truth. It's about describing how things are as opposed to formulating how they should be. And so it seems to me that there must be inherent limits on how useful political economy is to social justice movements.
Well, as we were sort of doing this, I was sort of like, I've sort of witnessed on Facebook among friends who are, between the academic and organizing worlds and, trying to figure out roles. And so this presentation was making me think about it, and I think there's a real value to, we do this for a living and are scholars of this for a living and do this descriptive work, and then it's up to people to decide what the prescriptive, response is, and that may be different. So I don't, political economy as like a social science, like it may not be appropriate for it to be prescriptive in certain ways, right? Like I think that those descriptive tools are really useful, especially when we live in a narrative that is so monolithic, and it's so hard to fight back against this concept of, oh, well, this is efficient, and what do you say to that? Like I remember in high school, these like guys being like, well, this is efficient, and war is efficient, and and to have that vocabulary to like think beyond that, I think is really important.
And in the South African case, when we were fighting apartheid, there were two things we did. What's the balance of forces before we fight? Where is the correlation of forces? That was an offshoot from political economy. Because in the balance of forces, who's got economic power and how do they use it? And what's the relationship of economic power to political institutions and so on? So that was the one way in which we used it. But then the other way in which we used it was then to say, I forget the phrase, what is the weakest point in the political economic system, where then you can have points of attack. So it serves those purposes. Strategy and the political fight are something else, but they have to derive from an analysis. What I've just given you is radical political economy. Classical political economists would have a different approach to these questions. Market efficiency and so on.
Having this critical lens of descriptive truth that political economy gives us is necessary for these movements, but I guess my point was that it's not sufficient.
Oh yeah, then as a lawyer, well, the next step for you as a lawyer, having understood all of this, what then do I need to do to take the battle forward using the law? What are the limits, what are the possibilities? What is the role of the social forces to fight it out?
But I think it's
And
also
then the next workshop, which is very interesting, which is taking place on the next, the parallel one, is then those questions of strategy in broad philosophical terms will inform what you envision, as she was saying earlier. That's a broad scale, but bring it down to immediate battles, to immediate cases. The outcome you want from your analysis is informed. Let me rephrase that. Your analysis informs your outlook. Then once you have a particular outcome in mind, you develop tactics to achieve that. Does it make sense? The problem is just the nasty landlord. Let's talk about the nasty landlord, that's it. Maybe there's actually gentrification. Does it make sense? Huh?
Can you repeat that?
You've got a problem of eviction in one gentrifying part, but you don't know about gentrification. You just think the problem is the nasty landlord, and yet there's a wider systemic process. Once you grasp that, your approach will be different. Okay. We've done the first part. I just wanted to give two quick examples, then we can come to a conclusion. The Labor Relations Act, as we were saying, is part of this progressive framework of laws since '94. Basically, it ended apartheid labor relations. Workers have real rights. I get surprised at how workers cannot even bargain in some sectors in the US, because the Labor Relations Act is quite radical. Yet, despite the Labor Relations Act, the neoliberal restructuring of work, outsourcing, casualization, and so on, has ensured that a third of the formal workforce in South Africa is actually informal, has been deprived of these rights. So you can have law, but actually systems continue to find ways to restructure themselves in ways that bypass the law. That's just the one point I wanted to make. That push and pull, that's constant, that I was referring to earlier. Because those with economic interests do not ever stop to bypass, even if they lose. The story of the fight in Seattle, how they were wanting to repackage that in ways that actually achieve $15 an hour. It's actually fascinating. They realized there was so much social pressure, but still we were looking for a room not to yield to that demand. So this is another example of that. Another example, this is a case, Irene Grootboom. She was staying in a shack, and she basically used the constitution to claim, and went to the constitutional court, where the constitutional court affirmed her right to housing. She died 9 years after winning the case, still living in the shack, primarily because of fiscal allocations, because of the reproduction of apartheid geography in Cape Town, and because of the failure of government delivery. So, the structures constraining what is a constitutional right, subordinating it.
Besides its practical import, there was something else to exalt the marvelous success of this working men's measure. It was the first time that in broad daylight the political economy of the middle class succumbed to the political economy of the working class.
That was after the passing of the 10 hours bill, which was an outcome of mass struggle. It's an interesting phrase, the political economy of the working class winning in broad daylight over the political economy of the middle class. Classical neo English is running away from me now. I must be tired. But this is the heart of all of these things we're discussing. The Labor Relations Act, the political economy of labor, neoliberal restructuring of work, as the political economy of capital, contesting each other every day. That you then caught in that as radical lawyers.
True, and I find that the idea that passing like a labor bill is somehow, like a second priority or should be like a zero-sum game that somehow disadvantages the middle class is fundamental to a lot of the discussions we have in the US about the minimum wage and other things, that somehow we're like, by doing that or by protecting, working class people's rights, that we're gonna cost upper class people money is not actually true. It's never been proven in economic or social history. In fact, the better you treat workers, the more wealthy your society becomes. So I'm going to disagree with Marx on that one. I understand the point in terms of how that rarely happens and that we usually position those things as opposing, but it's not actually true. And I think thinking of them as opposing is one of the greatest barriers that we face to change, because we continue to see it as a zero-sum system rather than seeing millions of people now have more money to then go spend in an economy consuming the goods that they're supposed to be able to produce and consume that could also help other people be wealthy and go to college. So I just want to put that out there.
Okay, colleagues, mine was not to present, mine was just to facilitate discussion and see how we interact based on our experience with a theoretical body of work, which I made very crude and very simple. Thank you.